In May 2024, a man demolished a house in Indiana. He had bought it 7 years earlier to study it. He was a paranormal investigator, 30 years in the field. The kind of man who had spent entire nights inside haunted houses. Without ever losing his composure, he destroyed this one. Not because it was falling apart, not for a real estate project. He razed it because in 7 years of investigation, he had arrived at a conclusion he expressed in 2 words: pure evil. The house was called Willow's Weep. It stood in Cayuga, a village in Indiana that no one had heard of until a History Channel show called it the most evil house in America. This is its story. Cayuga was the kind of village that Americans drove through without stopping. 500 people in Vermilion County, at the far western edge of Indiana, so close to the Illinois state line, you could practically spit across it. The Wabash River ran a few miles to the south. A little further on, a smaller tributary joined the main river, 2 waterways converging in that flat plain at that precise spot, as though the terrain itself had been drawn so that things would meet there. The house stood at a crossroads on the edge of the village. From the road, there was nothing remarkable about it. A story and a half, roughly 1,400 square feet, white walls yellowed by time, a wooden porch sagging in places, the kind of house found everywhere in that region, built at the end of the 19th century, when farms grew along the rivers and families settled wherever the soil was good. But when you looked at the house from above, from an aeroplane, a drone, or simply a satellite view, you noticed something that was not visible from the ground. The floor plan formed a cross, not a rough approximation, not an L or a T that could be interpreted from a distance, a clean, symmetrical cross, with 4 arms radiating from a center, the kind of layout almost never seen in American residential architecture because nobody built their house in the shape of a cross. It was inefficient, expensive, and corresponded to no local tradition, unless the house had not been built for living in. Dave Spinks, the paranormal investigator who would eventually buy the property decades later, noted that the cross was oriented toward the east. Other observers, less charitable, pointed out that an east-facing cross, viewed from the sky, resembled an inverted cross. The house had been built in the 1890s by a man named Annual Sides, the village postmaster, a reclusive, solitary man about whom the neighbors knew little. He had designed the house in the shape of a cross, with a main room whose interior layout suggested a pentagram, all doors and windows placed at the angles. And despite all the rooms he had built, Annual Sides spent most of his life in just one of them, as though he were afraid of the rest of his own house. He died there, and that was only the beginning. Minnie Lamb was the first resident whose name survived in the records. Her husband was Annual Sykes, and they had a daughter, Mary May Runyon. In 1923, a doctor was called to the house to examine Mary May. His diagnosis was entered into the local records. The young woman was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. She recovered, but the fact that the house was already making its occupants ill by the 1920s would go unnoticed for decades. Minnie died in the house in 1932, officially of bronchial pneumonia. People died of pneumonia in rural Indiana in the 1930s. It happened. What happened next, however, formed a pattern. A man died in the bathtub. The exact circumstances remained unclear. Accident, seizure, something else. But the fact remained. A man had walked into that bathroom and never walked out alive. 3 suicides were recorded over the decades, 1 by hanging, the other 2 by gunshot. 3 people who had chosen to end their lives inside that house, as though something had driven them to it, or as though the walls themselves had absorbed enough despair to manufacture more. 3 men were poisoned. That, at least, was the claim of Brenda Johnson, who would buy the house years later and spend months piecing together its history. Poisoned by whom? Why? Under what circumstances? No one knew any longer. The names had been lost. The police reports, if they had ever existed, had vanished. All that remained was the rumor passed from owner to owner, like an inheritance no one wanted. In the 1930s, a worker renovating the house fell from the roof and died on impact. His colleagues gathered their tools and left without finishing the job. They refused to come back. And then there were the Skinners. In 1999, Curtis and Cheryl Skinner bought the house. They wanted to renovate it, make it livable. For 2 years, they tried. And for 2 years, the house did what it had always done. In 2001, Cheryl died at 42 of a myocardial infarction. The medical records indicated she had died at the hospital, a heart attack. Nothing supernatural on paper. Curtis stayed in the house alone after his wife's death. 5 years. 5 years in that cross-shaped building, with the silence, the banging, and the memory of Cheryl all around him. In 2006, he shot himself in the head. He was 63. He was sitting in an armchair between the kitchen and the living room when he pulled the trigger. The blood-stained chair remained in the house. No one removed it. No one touched it. It was still there when paranormal investigators began arriving years later, a chair stained with dried blood, in a room where no one sat anymore. The investigators who visited the house after the Skinners found inscriptions scrawled on the walls and mirrors. 2 phrases, always the same, in different rooms. Find me. Help me. No one knew who had written them. The investigators attributed them to Cheryl's spirit. But Cheryl had died at the hospital, according to the records. So why was something inside this house still asking to be found? And amid all of this, someone had hidden something between the floors. During a renovation, a worker pulling up floorboards discovered a gap between the old floor and the new one, and in that gap, 2 books. The first was a work on necromancy, the art of communicating with the dead, summoning them, binding them to a place. The second was titled, Do Spirits Exist?, and had been written by someone from the Cayuga Church of Christ, the village church. Someone, at some point in the house's history, had performed rituals within those walls, and someone else had asked whether what they were seeing was real. The 2 books side by side beneath the floorboards, like a conversation between faith and fear. What made Willows Weep different from other haunted houses was not the deaths. People died in houses all over the world, and that alone did not make them evil. What made this house different was what it did to the living. Every person who had inhabited Willows Weep for more than a few weeks described the same process, in the same order, using the same words, as though the house followed a protocol. It began with exhaustion, a crushing, disproportionate fatigue that settled in within the first days. The occupants slept 10 hours and woke more tired than the night before, as though something were draining their energy while they slept. Then the fatigue gave way to something darker, black thoughts, a creeping paranoia, the feeling that the outside world was turning hostile, and that the house itself was the only safe place. And after a few weeks, the suicidal ideation arrived, the sudden urge to hang oneself in the hallway, the image of a gun, precise, violent impulses that surged from nowhere and left no room for reason. 3 people had yielded to those impulses. The others had fled. Dave Spinks, when he began his research, compared Willows Weep to a psychological leech. The house drained its occupants, slowly, methodically, week after week, until nothing remained but a hollow shell incapable of resistance. And once they were sufficiently weakened, the physical phenomena began. The house had operated this way for decades, owner after owner, tenant after tenant, the same cycle repeated, the move-in, the hope, the exhaustion, the collapse, the flight or the death. No one lasted long. And then, in the early 2000s, someone decided to try their luck. Brenda Johnson knew. When she bought Willows Weep in the early 2000s, she knew the house's history. People had warned her, the neighbors, the village elders, even the estate agent, with the visible relief of a man hoping to offload a problem. Don't do it, a neighbor had told her. That house is not right. Brenda did not listen. She had her reasons. The price, the space, the desire to renovate, perhaps the taste of a challenge. She signed the papers, took the keys, and entered Willows Weep, with renovation plans under her arm and the energy of someone who believes a house can be changed with love and a fresh coat of paint. For the first weeks she worked hard. She stripped wallpaper, repointed joints, cleaned windows that had not seen a cloth in years. The house breathed dust and damp wood. But Brenda did not care. She had known worse. She was used to fighting. And then the sounds began. Bangings. That was the word she would use later, because there was no better one. Heavy, violent thuds from beneath the floor, not the creaks of a house settling, blows, as though someone were striking the underside of the boards from below, as though something were trying to get out. The first time, Brenda went down to the basement to check. There was nothing, no one, just the darkness, the bare earth, and the smell of a cellar that had not been aired in far too long. She went back upstairs. The blows resumed. The bangings did not stop. They became daily, then permanent, like a metronome of terror marking out Brenda's days. In the morning when she woke, in the afternoon during the renovation work, at night when she tried to sleep. And they were not the only signs. Brenda began to feel watched, in a precise, constant way, as though someone were standing behind her every time she turned her back. She would spin around and there was nothing, but the sensation did not leave. It clung to her skin like an invisible spider's web. Then came the scratches. One morning, stepping out of the shower, Brenda saw red marks on her arm in the bathroom mirror, 3 parallel lines, clean, like animal scratches. She had no cat. She had not scratched herself in her sleep. The marks were too regular, too deep, too precise for that. The next day, new scratches appeared on her shoulder, then on her thigh, then on her back, in a spot she could not reach herself. Something was marking her during the night, something with claws. The exhaustion set in exactly as the former occupants had described it. Brenda, an active and energetic woman, found herself unable to get up in the morning. She slept 10 hours and woke shattered, her eyes heavy, her body like lead. The renovation work slowed, then stopped. She no longer had the strength to lift a hammer. The dark thoughts came next, intrusive ideas that were not her own, images of violence that appeared in her mind without warning, the rope in the hallway, the blade in the drawer, the drop at the edge of the porch. She shook her head to chase them away, but they returned, always, like flies around a wound. What is in that house is purely evil, she would later tell the History Channel investigators. It is there to cause harm. The physical phenomena began once Brenda was sufficiently weakened to no longer resist. Heavy footsteps in the corridors, regular, deliberate, as though someone massive were walking from room to room without hurrying. Brenda lay rigid in her bed, listening to the steps cross the hallway, stop outside her door, then move on. Whispers through the walls, low, indistinct voices, like a conversation between several people in the next room. When Brenda opened the door, the room was empty, but the voices continued for a few seconds longer, as though they did not know she was listening. Shadows moved in the corners of the house, dark, dense silhouettes that shifted with apparent intention. One of them, taller than the rest, returned often. The investigators who came later would give it a name, the Creeper, a massive, vaguely human shape that stood in the angles of the rooms and watched. One morning, Brenda found the bathroom door lying on the floor. The hinges were twisted, the wood torn from the frame, as though someone had wrenched it free in a single motion with brutal force. No one had heard a sound. Her son came to help with the ceiling renovation. He stood on a stepladder, arms raised, when planks he had firmly secured came loose and struck him. They did not fall, they flew, as though ripped free by an invisible hand. He was injured. Shortly after, Brenda discovered new scratches on her back. 6 parallel marks this time, as though a hand with one finger too many had raked her skin. 6 claws. She could not have reached the spot herself. No one had been close enough to make them. And then there was the maintenance man. Brenda had hired a worker to mow the lawn and carry out repairs. In front of the house stood a giant weeping willow, the tree that had given the property its name. In local folklore, the tree was said to harbor the spirits of vengeful dead. Brenda had warned the worker not to go near it. One day, she heard a scream outside. She ran out and found him unconscious, slumped against the exterior wall. The paramedics took him to the emergency room. The doctors discovered that his spine had been nearly fractured in several places. The man remembered nothing. Brenda suspected he had ignored her warning and gone too close to the willow. It was after this incident and after the scratches on her own body, that Brenda began to take seriously the stories she had dismissed until then. Weeks later, the worker returned to finish the job. Brenda had asked him to check the plumbing beneath the house. She wanted to know if the bangings had a mechanical cause. He opened the external access hatch and crawled under the house on his belly. Where he expected to find packed earth, he found mounds, bumps of various sizes like rodent burrows. He began clearing them to make his way through, and in the dirt, he found a bone. He wanted to convince himself it was an animal, a dog buried there decades ago, livestock that had crawled under the house and died. But he did not have time to think further. Hands he could neither see nor feel gripped him and tried to drag him deeper beneath the house. He struggled for what felt like an eternity before managing to crawl toward the exit. Brenda, working upstairs, heard the commotion and came outside just in time to see the worker emerge from the hatch on his belly, gasping, panicked. He threw the bone at her and told her he would never set foot under that house again, and that if she had a problem with it, she could find another contractor. Brenda picked up the bone and took it to a local doctor. The diagnosis was immediate. It was not an animal bone. It was an intact human humerus, that of a child, dead for a long time. The police were called, but the bone was over 50 years old, too old. The authorities refused to open an investigation. No one ever learned whose bone it was. No one searched for the rest. Brenda barely slept anymore. She barely ate. She had lost weight, lost her color, lost the fighting energy that had driven her to buy the house against everyone's advice. The house had done its work. It had drained her. Brenda Johnson left Willows weep. She gave no precise date and no turning point. There was no final spectacular incident, no Hollywood climax of running screaming into the night. It was more insidious than that. One morning she woke and understood that she simply could not stay, that if she remained one more week, she would never leave. Not because she would not want to, but because she would no longer have the strength. She packed the bare minimum, got into her car, started the engine. As she drove away, something loosened in her chest, like a fist that had been gripping her for weeks, slowly releasing its hold. The exhaustion did not vanish at once. It took days, perhaps weeks, to recover a semblance of normal energy. But the dark thoughts faded. The scratches stopped appearing. The world became a place she wanted to be in again. Brenda sold the house to Dave Spinks in 2017, a paranormal investigator from West Virginia, 30 years of experience, who bought it for one purpose: to understand what was happening inside. She wished him luck. She thought he would need it. Dave Spinks was not an amateur. He had been investigating the paranormal since the 1990s. Dozens of haunted locations across West Virginia, Pennsylvania, the entire eastern United States. Books, documentaries, lectures. He knew what he was doing. When he heard about Willow's Weep, he saw an opportunity. A paranormal laboratory. A place where the phenomena were consistent enough to be studied, measured, documented. Not a house where you waited weeks for a glass to move. A place where something happened every night. He bought the property and moved in. The first days were calm. Spinks set up his cameras, his EMF detectors, his audio recorders. He mapped the house room by room, logging temperatures, drafts, background noise. He applied the method he had refined over 30 years. Observe, measure, draw no premature conclusions. Then the house began to answer. One of the first nights, Spinks sat alone in the living room, headphones on, listening to the recorders he had placed in every room. The house was silent. The cameras filmed empty rooms. The EMF readings were normal. Nothing moved. Then he felt something shift in the air. The temperature dropped several degrees in seconds. He saw it on the thermometer before he felt it on his skin. The silence grew thicker, denser, as though the house itself were holding its breath. Spinks removed his headphones and listened. The bangings began beneath his feet, the same ones Brenda had described. Heavy, regular thuds rising from the basement, making the floorboards vibrate beneath his chair. He looked down and saw dust dancing between the gaps in the planking with each impact. He stayed seated. He did not go down to check. He had read the file. He knew there would be nothing down there. The blows stopped after a few minutes. The temperature climbed back. The silence returned to normal. Spinks noted the time, the duration, the intensity. He already knew this was only the beginning. Paranormal teams came from across the country to investigate Willow's Weep. Some were seasoned, accustomed to nights spent in allegedly haunted locations. Others were amateurs chasing a thrill. Several teams refused to enter after arriving. They sat in their cars, looked at the house through the windshield and drove away. Something about the place repelled them before they had even crossed the threshold. Those who entered did not all stay until the end. The reports overlapped on several points. The shadows were constant. Every team that spent a night in the house reported dark silhouettes moving through the rooms, distinct opaque masses that shifted with apparent intent. The creeper appeared in every testimony, a tall, broad-shouldered shape that stood in the corners and seemed to observe the investigators with the patience of a spider. The children were there too. Several investigators captured children's voices on their recorders, laughter, crying, whispers, smaller, faster shadows that darted through the corridors like drafts. And there was Cheryl. The record said she had died of a heart attack in 2001, but the investigators sensed a female presence in the basement, desperate, terrified, as though someone had been trapped there and had never been able to get out. The inscriptions on the walls said, "Find me." Cheryl had died at the hospital, according to the records, but something, down there, was still asking to be found. But the most disturbing element was not the apparitions. It was the effect the house had on the people who entered it. Seasoned investigators, men and women who had spent hundreds of nights in haunted locations without losing their composure, left Willow's Weep with splitting headaches, nausea, and disproportionate exhaustion. Some reported intrusive thoughts, violent impulses, images of death that surged without warning. The same pattern Brenda had described. One investigator developed depressive symptoms in the days following his visit. Another felt followed for weeks after leaving, as though something from Willow's Weep had latched onto him and refused to let go. In 2019, the History Channel sent a crew to film an episode of The Unexplained, presented by William Shatner. The episode was titled Evil Places. Willow's Weep was called the most haunted house in America. Spinks published a book the same year, Willow's Weep, The Beginning. He described the house in words that a 30-year investigator did not use lightly, pure evil. For 7 years, Dave Spinks lived with Willow's Weep. 7 years of nights spent in the cross-shaped house, listening to the bangings beneath the floor, filming the shadows in the corridors, collecting testimonies from the teams that came and went. 7 years of trying to understand what lived in there. In May 2024, he called in a bulldozer. The house was leveled in a matter of hours. The walls collapsed. The roof caved in. The cross-shaped frame cracked and fell to pieces in a cloud of dust and rotting wood. 130 years of history reduced to a heap of rubble on a vacant lot at the edge of Cayuga. Spinks offered few public explanations. He simply said the house was extremely negative and that he had made the decision to destroy it. After 7 years of research, after a book, after a documentary, after dozens of investigations, he had concluded that some places could not be saved. Some places were not meant to exist. He purchased a new property in West Virginia shortly after, another paranormal project, another haunted location, but not like Willow's Weep. Nothing was like Willow's Weep. In Cayuga, Indiana, there was nothing left but a vacant lot at a crossroads between two rivers, at the edge of a village of 500 souls. The grass would grow back, brambles would cover the foundations, and in a few years, no one would know that a cross-shaped house had stood on that spot for 130 years, that a reclusive postmaster had lived and died in a single room, that Minnie Lamb, the Skinners, the man in the bathtub, the suicides and the poisoned had each left something of themselves inside, something that never left, that beneath the floorboards, a child's bone had waited decades to be found, and no one had searched for the rest. Dave Spinks had spent his career entering haunted houses, spending nights inside them, documenting what he found, and leaving. He had never destroyed a site of investigation. He had never concluded that a place was too dangerous to exist, except this one. But the land was still there. The crossroads was still there. the rivers still converged at the same point, and whatever had lived beneath the floor may not have needed a floor.